Welcome back to Hard Money. Joining me this week is investor, analyst, and author Mark Moss. Mark, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Natalie. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, I want to get your take on this macro environment. We've seen some equities and Bitcoin rally recently, but the Fed's still trying to fight inflation, hiking rates. What do you see? What do you want us to know?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what we consider macro and what we consider micro. So, I mean, looking at that, what we can see is since the Fed basically had their meeting back a couple of months ago, we've seen the markets have been rallying. Gold's up about 6.5%. We've seen Bitcoin's up 36%. Nasdaq's up about 36% since about June 17th. So everything's rallying off of that. Of course, we've seen the 2-year and the 10-year both made their peaks around the same time, June 14th, have since come down a couple points, 7%. Et cetera. And so we're seeing this rally. Now, a lot of people want to know, is this a bear market rally? Is this a fake out or is this a real rally? And of course, we won't know until we're looking backwards on it. But I think it's probably real for now. And so if you look at take the NASDAQ, for example, and zoom out, look at a chart from like 2008 till present, draw a trend line, and you'll see that it stayed right on trend. And that looks very impressive. As a matter of fact, one of our mutual friends, Dr. Jeff Ross, the perma bear, I had him on my show and we looked at that chart together plus a number of other charts. And he says, dang, Mark, you might be changing my mind. And so I think this is a real rally. It's not a fake out that we're seeing right now, but I think that's still zoomed in a little bit too far. And so I wouldn't really call that the macro. I think that's more of the micro.
Well, what do you think that the Fed is doing right and what do you think they're doing wrong?
Anything the Fed is doing is inherently wrong. Let's just say that. All manipulation is bad, in my opinion. And now they're just trying to see if they can help things, but it seems to only make them worse. I think the narrative that we're all following is wrong, and it misleads us to believe what the Fed can do and will do. So what do I mean by that? We're talking about this soft landing. Can the Fed engineer a soft landing? Well, they would assume that the economy, this complex system like the economy, the markets, et cetera, are like this complex fighter jet that has all these different rudders and ailerons and stuff that you can change the direction of this flight plan. And the Fed could somehow masterfully, drive this ship to a soft landing. The reality is that it's more like a blimp, and all they can do is add hot air. That's about all they can do. So there's no hope of a soft landing. I think it's a completely wrong analogy. This thing is so complex. It's gotten so far away from them. They're trying to only just control the air. All right. All they can do is control the Fed funds rate. And they're trying to manage the entire economy made of trillions of inputs. And so I think it's a wrong analogy.
You know, there are lessons to be learned in every single bear market, some hard lessons sometimes to be learned. So what are the takeaways you think in this bear market so far?
Well, I think it depends on the time frame, right? And so what are people trying to understand? What should I do in the next 6 months? What should I do in the next couple of years? What should I do by the end of the decade? And so what time frames? And so in the macro, I don't consider that macro. This is kind of like short term, like what's going to happen in the next couple of months. Can the Fed save us from this giant deflationary crash that some of these, David Hunters or others would declare we're having a Harry Dent or something? We're going to have an 80% drawdown before the election happens, as some of these predictions have been. So can they stave that off? And I think the answer is they probably can, but there's way bigger problems on the horizon. The problem is that, they say generals always try to fight the last war, and they're trying to fight this. They've been, for the last, 250 years, they've been fighting off deflation. So as the world has been globalizing, it's been a massive deflationary force, which has been great. It's allowed them to print hundreds of trillions of dollars. So it's been great. So inflationary monetary system and a deflationary long-term secular trend. And that's because we're offshoring jobs, we're offshoring manufacturing, et cetera. But the world is changing right now. And we're going from a long-term secular deflationary period to now a long-term secular inflationary period. So as this world continues to break apart, as we see Russia and Ukraine situation exacerbate, as we see China, the situation with supply chains, et cetera, we're now reshoring supply chains on the United States, manufacturing, all that's changing. And that's going to be very inflationary. War is very inflationary. More government policies, which we all know we're going to get. It just got passed today. All of that is very inflationary. So the Fed's been fighting deflation. They think they're still trying to fight deflation, but the reality is what they're fighting now is inflation, and it's going to be a much different world than what they're seeing right now.
Well, Mark, I love watching your videos. You've covered so much ground. You talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what's happening in Sri Lanka, energy. What are you tracking right now? What can we expect?
Well, one of the big story that popped up today that I thought was very fascinating, I put on Twitter earlier, was we know that Russia and the BRICS nations, the BRICS, BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We know the BRICS nations have been continued to be joined by more and more nations. They make up about 50% of the population of the world. And they've been working on, creating their own associations, coming up with their own currency. They're coming up with their own payment network, like a SWIFT network. But they announced today that they're going to come up with their own gold agency. So we use the LBMA, London Bullion Market. And they want to come up with their own. And the reason why is, as anybody would probably guess, the LBMA is complete manipulation. In the morning, a couple of guys get on the phone and they say, what should the price of gold be today? And I'm not exaggerating it. That's really how it happens. And so you can understand how manipulated that is. And then, of course, a few months ago, there was a story of that billionaire who had that big nickel bet, and the LME reversed it, and he lost, millions of dollars or billions of dollars, however much. And so they understand how manipulated this is. And if Russia and China and the BRICS want to move to this new monetary system that may be backed by gold, as they're saying, then they need to get away from that manipulated gold environment that they're in. And so this move to set up their own LBMA is massive, in my opinion, if they go through with it, which I think there's a good chance they will. They don't just talk, they actually do things. Then what it will do is it'll break the back of the LBMA. What does that mean? Well, it's step one of this evolution that we're in, or maybe it's further along. What happens is first you break the grip of manipulation on the gold asset price, which then continues to break down the fiat money system. Now, we all know that gold failed because of the centralization aspect, right? It lacks one of the main attributes of money, which is portability. And so they'll try to go back to gold to try to get some trust back into the system, and they'll wallow around in that for a while. And then eventually it's just going to push people back to Bitcoin. So I think that's really big news that broke today that most people probably haven't really realized it yet.
Wow. Well, everything's good for Bitcoin, right? While I still have you, Mark, you recently released your book that you co-authored with Alex Svetsky, The Uncommunist Manifesto. Why was now an important time to release that message and write a counterpoint to the Communist Manifesto?
It is a very important time. And I think as we hope it could be the zeitgeist of its time, like it's the right book at the right time. And so I think we're seeing this all over right now in different forms, and people haven't really picked this up, but it's Marxism. Marxism just won't go away. It continues to be reincarnated and just kind of reintroduce itself over and over. And so what we see at the World Economic Forum today, this 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy, is nothing new. This is the same thing that's been fed to us since Karl Marx wrote the original Communist Manifesto. In it, he said, if I summarize communism in one statement, it would be the abolition of private property. And so all of these attacks that we're seeing against the farmers and the fertilizer and you and not eating your red meat and all of these attacks that we're seeing from everywhere and just the slogan, you'll own nothing and be happy, is all about Marxism. All of Klaus Schwab's dreams of this stakeholder capitalism. What we're seeing with the fights in the government, we're seeing with the Twitter censors and takedowns of prominent people like Alex Bernstein. Those are all examples of Marxism that just won't go away. And so what we wanted to do is the original book, I think the ideas are really infectious and sticky because they give people justification for their own human or sinful urges, like greed and deceit and laziness and things like that. And so they one, give people justification for that, and two, a plan to go get other people's wealth. And so those appealing to some people. And I think we've really not tried to go back against the book tit for tat, but rather just reintroduce a set of principles that I think encourages people to be better versions of themselves, help build each other up. And we believe a cooperative world is much better than a coercive world. And we hope this book will really help usher that in.
We hope that you enjoyed that interview. Make sure that you like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any hard money content.